Have you ever felt completely invisible? Like you're a ghost in a room full of people? Your presence nothing more than a whisper of air. They walk right through. For Ella Vance, that feeling was a crushing reality. Standing in the middle of the most opulent charity gala of the year, surrounded by the titans of industry and the darlings of New York society, she had never felt more alone. Just 1 year ago, she was one of them. Tonight, she was a nobody, the discarded ex-wife. But in a single breathtaking moment, everything was about to change. One man, a man whose name was a legend, whispered in tones of awe and fear, was about to shatter her invisibility with 5 unbelievable words. This is the story of how a woman ignored by everyone was suddenly introduced to the world as a billionaire's fiancée. The chandeliers of the New York Public Library's Astor Hall dripped with a light so brilliant it seemed to mock the shadows where Ella Vance had taken refuge. Each crystal prism scattered the light into 1,000 tiny rainbows, none of which dared to touch her. She clutched a lukewarm glass of champagne, the bubbles long dead, a perfect metaphor for how she felt. Her dress, a simple but elegant navy blue silk sheath from a consignment shop on the Upper East Side, had felt like a small act of defiance when she'd put it on. It was classic, timeless. But here, amidst the custom-made Oscar de la Renta gowns and the glittering New Season Chanel, it was a quiet admission of defeat. It marked her as what she was, a relic from a past life. Just 18 months ago, she would have walked into this very room on the arm of Richard Sterling. Her name then, Ella Sterling, would have been on every guest list. People would have air-kissed her cheeks, complimented her, or rather Richard's choice of jewelry, and listened with feigned interest as she spoke about her work curating for the underfunded American Folk Art Museum. She hadn't been a person she realized now. She had been an accessory. Richard's well-read, tastefully dressed art historian wife. Tonight she was just Ella Vance, and she was here on a professional Hail Mary. Her museum was on the brink of financial collapse, and the annual New York Philanthropic Legacy Gala was its last hope. She had spent weeks securing a single, deeply discounted ticket, hoping to corner a potential donor to make a passionate plea for the preservation of art that told the story of America's unsung creators. But the room was a fortress of closed circles. Men in bespoke tuxedos laughed loudly, their Patek Philippe watches glinting as they gestured. Women with surgically perfected smiles and diamonds the size of robin's eggs clustered together, their conversation a low, venomous hum. Ella tried to approach a few people she recognized from her old life. An older woman, Mrs. Astor, whose family had once donated a small piece to the museum, looked straight through her, her gaze landing on a more prominent guest behind Ella's shoulder. A former friend, one of her bridesmaids, gave her a tight, pitying smile and a hurried, "So good to see you," before turning her back. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that started at her neck and crept up to her cheeks. She felt the familiar sting behind her eyes, the one she'd fought back for months after Richard had announced he was leaving her. "It's not you, Ella, it's me." He had said the classic coward's line. "I need something. More. Something with more energy. More synergy with my brand." His synergy had a name: Tiffany Vandersloot, a 24-year-old heiress to a chain of boutique hotels whose primary skill was documenting her lavish life for 3 million Instagram followers. Richard had traded Ella's quiet intelligence and shared history for a life that played better on social media. The divorce had been swift and brutal. His high-powered lawyers from Skadden Arps had painted her as an ungrateful spouse, and she'd walked away with little more than her dignity and a small settlement that was quickly dwindling. And then, as if the universe had a penchant for cruel irony, she saw them. Richard stood near the grand staircase, looking insufferably handsome in a Tom Ford tuxedo. On his arm was Tiffany, poured into a glittering, nearly transparent gold dress that left nothing to the imagination. Her laugh was high and sharp, grating on Ella's nerves, even from across the hall. They were the center of a magnetic circle of admirers. Ella's instinct was to flee, to slip out the side door and disappear into the anonymity of the New York night. But something held her rooted to the spot. It was a flicker of her old self, the woman who wouldn't be chased out of her own life. She had as much right to be here as they did. Straightening her shoulders, she took a deliberate sip of her flat champagne and turned her attention to a nearby painting, pretending to be absorbed in its brushstrokes. It was a futile effort. She felt their approach before she saw them, a shift in the energy of the room as people parted for them. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in." Richard's voice was smooth-laced with a familiar condescending amusement. Ella turned slowly, schooling her features into a mask of polite indifference. "Richard, Tiffany, you're looking well." Tiffany's eyes, framed by impossibly long lashes, raked over Ella's simple dress. A small, cruel smirk played on her perfectly glossed lips. "Ella, I almost didn't recognize you without the Sterling name attached. It's amazing how some people can just fade into the background, isn't it?" The insult landed like a physical blow. Richard, to his credit, looked momentarily uncomfortable. "Tiffany, be nice." "What I am being nice," she chirped, snuggling closer to his arm. "I just think it's so brave of you to come here, all by yourself, trying to raise money for that little museum of yours. It's for like old quilts and stuff, right? So quaint." Every word was designed to diminish her, to remind her of her fall from grace. Ella's hands clenched at her sides. She wanted to say something cutting, to mention that Tiffany's grandfather had probably slept on one of those quaint quilts before he made his fortune, but the words wouldn't come. She was paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated malice. "We were just talking to Harrison Blackwood about the new pediatric wing he's funding at Mount Sinai." Richard continued, his tone dripping with self-importance. "He's pledging 8 figures. That's the kind of philanthropy that really matters, you know, big picture stuff." The implication was clear. Her little museum was insignificant. Her life's work was a joke. Ella felt the room begin to close in. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the scent of expensive perfume. It was all suffocating her. She was invisible, and now she was being mocked for it. The walls of her composure were about to crumble. "If you'll excuse me," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She turned to leave, her vision blurring, her only goal to reach the exit before the tears fell. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She took 2 steps before a voice, calm and low, with an unmistakable current of authority, cut through the noise. It wasn't loud, but it silenced the entire area around them. "I don't believe we've been introduced." Ella stopped. The voice was coming from just behind her. She turned, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing there was Julian Croft. Not just any billionaire, the billionaire. A man so wealthy and reclusive he was practically a myth. Croft was a legend in the world of finance and tech, a ruthless visionary who had built an empire from nothing. He never gave interviews. He was rarely photographed. His presence at a public event like this was unheard of. Yet here he was, his piercing gray eyes fixed not on Richard or Tiffany, but on her. He was impossibly tall, with dark hair lightly silvered at the temples and a face that looked like it was carved from granite. He wore a simple, perfectly tailored black suit with no tie, an act of defiance that screamed more power than any diamond-studded watch ever could. Richard Sterling, a man who prided himself on his unflappability, was visibly flustered. "Mr. Croft, I'm Richard Sterling Capital. It's an honor." He extended a hand which Julian Croft completely ignored. His gaze remained locked on Ella. "You were leaving?" he asked, his voice a quiet rumble that sent a strange shiver down her spine. Before she could answer, Tiffany, never one to be out of the spotlight, pushed forward. "She was just going. We were just catching up. I'm Tiffany Vandersloot, by the way. It is like a total dream to meet you." Julian Croft's eyes flickered to Tiffany for a fraction of a second, his expression one of utter disinterest. Then they returned to Ella, a curious, unreadable light in their depths. "I'm sorry, I don't think she was going anywhere," he said, his voice dropping another degree. He took a step forward, closing the small distance between them, and gently took Ella's hand. His touch was warm and firm, a startling anchor in her sea of humiliation. The entire group fell silent, watching, waiting. Julian Croft looked from Ella to a stunned Richard, and a slack-jawed Tiffany. A ghost of a smile touched his lips as he lifted her hand, his thumb stroking softly over her knuckles. Then, in that voice that could move markets and topple corporations, he shattered the world as they knew it. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his eyes never leaving Ella's. "Richard, Tiffany, I'd like you all to meet my fiancée, Ella Vance." The silence that followed Julian Croft's announcement was a living entity. It was absolute, profound, sucking the air out of the grand hall. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the frantic, hammering beat of Ella's own heart. Fiancée. The word echoed in the cavern of her skull, nonsensical and terrifyingly real. Richard's face, normally a carefully composed mask of smug superiority, had crumpled into a canvas of disbelief. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. Tiffany's professionally plumped lips were parted in a silent O of shock, her perfectly curated expression of disdain wiped clean. The fawning sycophants who had surrounded them just moments before were now staring, their eyes wide, darting between the reclusive billionaire and the woman they had all dismissed as a piece of irrelevant social debris. Ella felt a dizzying wave of vertigo. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. This had to be a mistake, a cruel, elaborate joke. She looked at Julian Croft, searching his granite-carved features for an explanation. His gray eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw not a hint of jest, but a calm, unwavering intensity. He gave her hand a barely perceptible squeeze, a silent command, "Play along." And somehow she did. Her years of training as a curator of maintaining a poised facade in front of wealthy, often difficult patrons took over. She drew a breath, lifted her chin, and offered the stunned audience a small, shy smile, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The spell broke. The silence shattered into a cacophony of whispers. Julian Croft engaged. To her, Richard Sterling's ex-wife. "Did you see the look on Richard's face? I'd pay to have a photograph of that." Richard finally found his voice. "Fiancée." He stammered the word, sounding foreign and absurd on his tongue. That's not possible. Ella, what is this?" Before Ella could even think of a response, Julian stepped in, his body slightly shielding hers in a protective gesture. "It's quite possible, Sterling," he said, his voice cold and sharp as breaking ice. "Unless you're suggesting my fiancée doesn't know her own mind." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. To question Julian Croft was to invite ruin. Richard paled, visibly shrinking under the billionaire's glacial stare. "No, of course not. I was surprised, that's all." "Congratulations," he managed to choke out. He grabbed Tiffany's arm, who was still staring at Ella with a mixture of raw hatred and disbelief. "We should go get a drink." He practically dragged his new wife away, her gold dress shimmering as she was pulled into the crowd. The moment they were gone, the dynamic shifted. The very people who had looked through Ella minutes ago were now descending upon her like moths to a flame. "Ella, darling, you look radiant," Mrs. Astor exclaimed, her hand clutching Ella's arm. "You must tell me everything." "A Croft, my dear, you've landed the biggest fish in the ocean," another voice trilled. "Is that a Cartier ring? We're all dying to see it." Ella stared down at her left hand, still held in Julian's. It was bare. Panic seized her, but Julian was preternaturally calm. "We're keeping things private for now," he stated smoothly, his voice carrying an air of finality that brooked no argument. He then turned to Ella. "Darling, you look like you could use some fresh air. Shall we—" It wasn't a question. He didn't wait for an answer, simply guided her through the throng of gawkers, his hand now firmly on the small of her back. They moved with an unnerving purpose, the crowd parting before them as if by magic. He led her not to the main entrance, but through a side door she hadn't noticed, into a service corridor, and then up a flight of stairs to a small private balcony overlooking Fifth Avenue. The cool night air was a welcome shock to her system. The distant sounds of traffic were a soothing hum compared to the buzz of gossip inside. Ella leaned against the balustrade, her legs feeling weak. She finally turned to face him. "What was that?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a cocktail of confusion, anger, and a bizarre, exhilarating rush of adrenaline. "Fiancée, are you insane?" Julian Croft was unperturbed. He leaned against the opposite railing, the city lights painting stark shadows across his face. "It seemed like a viable solution to your immediate problem." My immediate problem was a few catty remarks. "Your solution was to publicly announce a fake engagement to a man I've never met." "People have phones, Mr. Croft. That announcement will be on page 6 of the New York Post by morning." "I'm aware," he said calmly. "And please call me Julian." Ella stared at him dumbfounded. Why would you do that?" He was silent for a moment, studying her with that same unnerving intensity. "Let's just say," he began, his voice low, "that I am not an admirer of Richard Sterling, and I have an aversion to seeing people of substance being treated as if they have none." The unexpected compliment disarmed her for a second. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about my substance. I know you're the curator for the American Folk Art Museum. I know you've tripled their attendance in 2 years on a shoestring budget. I know you wrote your dissertation on the socio-economic implications of post-war Appalachian quilting, a piece of academic work that was both brilliant and criminally overlooked. And I know you're here tonight looking terrified but determined to try and save the one thing you care about. I know enough." Ella was stunned into silence. He knew about her dissertation. No one had ever read that besides her thesis committee and her parents. How could he possibly know these things? "How?" she started. "I do my research," he said, simply cutting her off. He pushed himself off the railing and took a step closer. "Which brings us to the real reason we're out here. I didn't do that simply for the theater, Ms. Vance. I did it because I have a proposition for you." Ella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "A proposition?" "Yes. What you saw in there was a preview, a demonstration of what my name, my association can do for you. The people who ignored you will now court you. The donors who wouldn't return your calls will be lining up to speak with you. Your little museum will suddenly become the most fashionable philanthropic cause in New York." He was right. She knew with a sickening certainty that he was absolutely right. The power he wielded was terrifying. "And what do you get out of this arrangement?" she asked, her voice cautious. This was the part where he named his price. She steeled herself for something sordid, something demeaning. "I also have a problem, Ms. Vance," he said, his expression turning serious. "A business problem. I am in the final stages of acquiring a very old, very conservative family-owned company in Switzerland. The patriarch, a man named Jean-Pierre Duval, is 80 years old and believes a man's character can be judged by the stability of his personal life. He sees me as a ruthless, solitary predator. A wolf, as he puts it. He is hesitant to sign over his family's legacy to such a man." He paused, his gray eyes locking onto hers. He needs to see that the wolf can be tamed. He needs to see me as a stable, settled man. A man who is about to be married. A man with a fiancée who is intelligent, respectable, and completely unimpeachable. Someone like you. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He wasn't offering help, he was offering a transaction. A cold, calculated business deal. "You want to hire me," she said flatly, "to be your fiancée." "I prefer the term mutually beneficial partnership," he corrected her. "You need your museum saved. I need my deal to go through. I propose a 6-month engagement. We attend a handful of key events together. You accompany me on one trip to Geneva to meet Mr. Duval, and we allow the press to take a few tastefully curated photographs. In return, I will make an anonymous donation to your museum that will not only erase its debt, but will also fund its operations and acquisitions for the next 50 years. I will also provide you with a generous personal stipend for your time and discretion. After 6 months, we announce an amicable parting of ways. No one gets hurt, and we both get what we want." He laid it all out with the dispassionate clarity of a CEO outlining a quarterly report. It was insane. It was immoral. It was everything she should have run screaming from. But then she thought of her museum, of the beautiful, fragile works of art entrusted to her care. She thought of her dedicated staff who were all facing layoffs. And she thought of Richard and Tiffany's smug, triumphant faces and the soul-crushing humiliation of being treated like nothing. Julian Croft wasn't offering her a fairy tale. He was offering her a weapon, a chance to not only save her life's work, but to reclaim her own narrative. There would be rules, she said, her mind already working the shock, giving way to a strange, steely resolve. A contract. A genuine, startlingly attractive smile finally broke through his stoic facade. I would expect nothing less. My lawyers can have a non-disclosure agreement and a contract drawn up by morning. He extended his hand. Do we have a deal, Ms. Vance? Ella looked at his outstretched hand, then back at his face. This was a deal with the devil, perhaps, but a devil who knew the intimate details of her academic work and despised her ex-husband. She thought of the future she was facing, a slow, painful decline into obscurity and failure. Then she thought of the future he was offering, a future where her museum was safe and she was no longer a ghost. She took his hand. His grip was as firm and resolute as his voice. We have a deal, Julian. As they stood there on the balcony high above the glittering city, a silent pact was sealed. It wasn't a promise of love or a whisper of romance. It was a contract signed in the cool night air, a strategic alliance born of desperation and opportunity. And as Julian led her back towards the Gala, back to the world that had cast her out, Ella knew one thing for certain: she was invisible no more. Returning to the Astor Hall on Julian Croft's arm was like walking into a different dimension. The very air seemed to crackle around them. If their exit had been a quiet ripple, their re-entrance was a tidal wave. The hushed whispers erupted into a low, excited roar. Every eye in the room was on them, on her. Ella felt a blush creep up her neck, but this time it wasn't from humiliation. It was a strange, heady mix of terror and power. Julian's hand rested confidently on the small of her back, a silent, steadying presence. He navigated the room with the ease of a shark parting a school of fish, heading straight for the Gala's host, Harrison Blackwood, the very man Richard had been bragging about earlier. Blackwood, a formidable man in his late 60s with a mane of white hair and a reputation for being gruffly dismissive, broke off his conversation mid-sentence as they approached. His eyes widened slightly. Croft, he said, his voice laced with surprise. Didn't expect to see you here. Harrison. Julian nodded, his tone easy but respectful. Good to see you. I wanted to properly introduce you to my fiancée, Ella Vance. Harrison Blackwood's gaze shifted to Ella. His eyes, which had held a polite but distant look for most of the evening, were now sharp with genuine interest. Ms. Vance, he said, taking her hand and giving it a surprisingly gentle shake. The pleasure is all mine. Any friend of Julian's is a friend of mine. But fiancé, you've managed to do what the entire financial world thought was impossible. Ella is full of surprises, Julian said smoothly, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that almost looked like a genuine smile. I've been hearing about the wonderful work you're doing over at the Folk Art Museum. Blackwood continued, his attention fully on Ella. My wife Eleanor is a great admirer of outsider art. We should arrange a private tour, and we must discuss your funding initiative. Perhaps my foundation can be of some assistance. Ella's mind reeled. Just an hour ago she would have considered getting 5 minutes of Harrison Blackwood's time a monumental victory. Now he was offering a private tour and a discussion about funding, all because of the man standing next to her. I would be delighted, Mr. Blackwood, she managed to say, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. Thank you. The rest of the evening passed in a surreal blur. One by one, the titans of New York society, the very people who had snubbed her, came to pay their respects. They complimented her dress, her intelligence, her understated elegance. They spoke to her not as an appendage but as a person of interest. They wanted to know her story, her opinions on art, her plans for the museum. She saw Richard and Tiffany across the room, watching her. They were standing alone, their former circle of admirers having migrated to orbit the Gala's new center of gravity, Ella and Julian. Tiffany's face was a thunderous mask of jealousy, while Richard's expression was a complex, unreadable mixture of fury and, was that regret? The sight gave Ella a grim, satisfying sense of victory. Julian played his part to perfection. He kept her close, his hand always touching her, her back, her arm, her hand. He would lean in to whisper something in her ear, his expression one of intimate amusement, though the words were usually something mundane like, "The man you're talking to launders money through his art purchases," or "Try the miniature lobster rolls, they're the only decent thing here." To the outside world they looked like a couple deeply in love, sharing private jokes. It was a masterful performance. By the time they left just after midnight, Ella was emotionally and mentally exhausted. Julian's driver, a silent man named Marcus, was waiting for them with a black Maybach so sleek it seemed to absorb the light around it. As the car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the flashing cameras of the paparazzi who had mysteriously appeared, Ella finally let her facade drop. She leaned her head back against the ridiculously soft leather and closed her eyes. That was... She started, unable to find the right word. Effective, Julian finished for her. Tomorrow the real work begins. The car glided silently through the streets of Manhattan, eventually pulling up in front of a modern, impossibly tall skyscraper in Triangle below Canal Street that Ella hadn't even known was residential. The penthouse, of course. The apartment was a testament to minimalist wealth. It was a cavernous space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a 360-degree view of the city lights. The furniture was sparse but exquisite, a Le Corbusier sofa here and Eames chair there. The walls were adorned not with paintings but with what looked like ancient manuscripts and maps, each framed like a priceless work of art. "Drink?" Julian asked, gesturing towards a bar that looked like it was carved from a single block of obsidian. "Water would be fine," she said, still feeling overwhelmed. He returned with 2 glasses. "My lawyer sent over the preliminary contract," he said, his tone shifting back to the brisk all-business manner from the balcony. He handed her a tablet. "Read it. My personal attorney, Evelyn Reed, will be in touch with you tomorrow to recommend an independent counsel for you to retain. I will, of course, cover all your legal fees. It is imperative that you have your own representation and that you are completely comfortable with every clause." Ella scrolled through the document. It was dense with legal jargon, but the core points were clear. A 6-month term, a schedule of required public appearances, a strict non-disclosure clause with a penalty so high it made her stomach clench. And then the numbers. The donation to the museum was even more generous than she had imagined, a figure that would secure its legacy for a century. The personal stipend was equally staggering. It was more money than she had ever thought she would see in her lifetime. There was also a section titled Rules of Engagement. No romantic entanglements with third parties. A requirement to present a united front at all times. A clause about maintaining a plausible narrative of their courtship, the details of which were to be mutually agreed upon. It was the coldest, most romantic document she had ever read. "There's one more thing," Julian said. He walked over to a safe concealed behind a panel in the wall and retrieved a small, dark blue box. He walked back and placed it on the marble coffee table in front of her. It was from Cartier. "This can't be part of the charade if you don't have the primary prop," he said dryly. With trembling fingers, Ella opened the box. Nestled inside on a bed of black velvet was the most magnificent ring she had ever seen. It wasn't a gaudy Tiffany-style diamond. It was a vintage piece, a flawless, square-cut emerald of a deep forest green flanked by 2 subtle baguette diamonds on a simple platinum band. It was elegant, unique, and breathtakingly beautiful. It looked like her. "How did you—" she whispered, staring at it. I told you. I do my research, he said. I know you did your master's thesis on the provenance of gemstones in Renaissance portraiture. You have a preference for colored stones over diamonds, and green is your favorite color. It was a logical deduction. This was more than research. This was an unnerving level of insight into her soul. Richard, her husband of 10 years, had once bought her a garish diamond necklace she'd hated on sight. This stranger, this man who was essentially hiring her, had chosen a ring that felt like it had been made just for her. "Put it on," he instructed. "You'll need to be wearing it from now on." She hesitated for a moment, then slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. The cool weight of the platinum was a tangible reminder of the bizarre reality of her situation. She was wearing a multi-million-dollar ring sitting in a billionaire's penthouse pretending to be his fiancée. "Now for our story," he said, sitting on the sofa opposite her. "We need to construct a narrative. Where did we meet? How long have we been seeing each other? The press will dig, so it needs to be plausible." And so for the next hour, high above the sleeping city, they built their lie. They decided they had met 6 months ago, introduced by a mutual acquaintance at a private art auction at Sotheby's. He had been taken with her passion and knowledge. They had started dating secretly, wanting to keep their relationship out of the public eye. Tonight wasn't a sudden announcement, but the culmination of a whirlwind private romance. As Ella recited the fabricated details back to him, a strange thing happened. The story began to feel less like a lie and more like an alternate history, a life she could have lived. The thought was both intoxicating and dangerous. "You're a quick study," Julian noted, a hint of approval in his voice. "I've spent my life studying history and provenance," Ella replied, looking down at the emerald gleaming on her finger. "I suppose creating a fake one isn't that different." He nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Get some rest. Marcus will take you home. Tomorrow Evelyn will call at 9 a.m. sharp. And Ella." "Yes. Welcome to the firm," he said, and for the first time she wasn't sure if he was talking about their business arrangement or the rarefied, dangerous world she had just entered. The morning after the gala felt like waking up in someone else's life. Ella's phone, usually silent save for messages from her mother and the occasional museum alert, was a relentless hive of activity. There were dozens of missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize and hundreds of text messages. Friends she hadn't heard from in years were suddenly desperate to catch up. Distant relatives were sending gushing congratulations. Her email inbox was overflowing with messages from reporters, bloggers, and even television producers. The top story on every major news outlet's website featured the same grainy photo of her and Julian leaving the library. His hand on her back, the headline screaming variations of "Reclusive Billionaire Julian Croft Engaged," or "Mystery Woman Captures the World's Most Eligible Bachelor." They called her an art world intellectual, a stunning brunette, and in the more salacious tabloids, a vengeful ex, who had traded up in spectacular fashion. It was dizzying. At precisely 9:00 a.m., as promised, a woman named Evelyn Reed called. Her voice was exactly as Ella had pictured, crisp, no-nonsense, and terrifyingly intelligent. She provided the name of a top-tier matrimonial lawyer, a woman named Sharon Glass, at Paul Weiss, and informed Ella that a retainer had already been paid on her behalf. "Mr. Croft insists you take this process as seriously as you would any multi-billion-dollar merger, Ms. Vance," Evelyn had said. "Your interests must be unequivocally protected." The next few days were a whirlwind of legal meetings. Ella, guided by the formidable Sharon Glass, went over the contract line by line. Clauses were added to protect her reputation in the event of a breach by Julian. The terms of the museum's donation were ironed out to ensure it was truly anonymous and irrevocable. Her personal stipend was placed in a blind trust. It was a surreal experience negotiating the terms of a fake relationship with the same rigor as a corporate takeover. Once the contracts were signed and notarized, the performance began in earnest. Julian, it turned out, was a brilliant director. He knew that their story needed to be sold not through grand pronouncements, but through carefully curated glimpses of private moments. Their first public outing was a stroll through Central Park on a crisp autumn afternoon. Julian had sent a car for her with a bag from Bergdorf Goodman inside. It contained a simple, elegant camel hair coat, a cashmere sweater, and a pair of perfectly tailored trousers. There was a note. "Wear these. We need to look like we belong together. J." As they walked near the Bethesda fountain, a paparazzo conveniently appeared. Julian, feigning annoyance, pulled Ella closer, shielding her face with his body as he hurried her away. The resulting photos were splashed across the internet within an hour, Julian Croft, the cold-hearted tycoon, being fiercely protective of his new love. Their second outing was a dinner at a famously exclusive restaurant, Rouse, a place so difficult to get into that reservations were practically inherited. Julian didn't have a reservation. He was a friend of the owner. They were seated at a quiet corner table, and for 2 hours they talked. Not about the contract or the plan, but about themselves. Ella found herself telling him about her childhood, about her passion for forgotten artists, about the quiet satisfaction of restoring a piece of history. In return, Julian spoke about his own past, not the glossy version from business magazines, but the raw story of a boy who grew up with nothing, who taught himself to code in a public library, and who built an empire on logic, discipline, and a relentless refusal to fail. He was guarded, but she saw flashes of the man behind the myth, a man with a dry wit, a profound loneliness, and an intellect so sharp it was almost intimidating. "You realize," she said, swirling the wine in her glass, "that Richard would never have asked me any of this." Julian raised an eyebrow. "What did he ask you about?" "He asked me what I thought of his new watch, or whether the caterer for his firm's Christmas party was prestigious enough," she said with a small, bitter laugh. "Our entire marriage was about maintaining an image. It's ironic that what I'm doing with you feels more honest in a way." His expression was unreadable. "This is also about maintaining an image, Ella. Don't forget that." The warning hung in the air between them, a necessary reminder of the artifice that bound them together. But as the weeks went on, the lines began to blur. He started sending her books he thought she'd like, first editions of historical texts, obscure poetry collections. She in turn would email him articles on art history that she thought might interest him, connecting the patterns of ancient trade routes to modern-day supply chains. A strange, unspoken intellectual intimacy began to grow between them. The impact on her professional life was seismic. The American Folk Art Museum was suddenly the hottest ticket in town. A gala she had hastily organized, which she'd once prayed would raise $50,000, brought in over $3 million. Donors who had ignored her for years were now calling her, personally pledging huge sums. Vogue did a feature on her, The Curator's Eye, painting her as a brilliant, overlooked talent finally getting her due. But with the success came a new kind of prison. She was no longer invisible, but she was also no longer free. Her every move was scrutinized. An innocent coffee with a male colleague from another museum was twisted into a tabloid headline. Croft's fiancée in secret lunch with mystery man. Julian had been furious, not because he was jealous, but because it was sloppy. "You are no longer just Ella Vance," he'd told her, his voice cold over the phone. "You are an extension of my brand. Every action you take reflects on me and on our objective. You must be more careful." The rebuke stung, reminding her of her status as a hired asset. She was living in a gilded cage, a beautiful prison where the bars were made of public perception, and the warden was Julian Croft. The ultimate test was fast approaching: the trip to Geneva to meet Jean-Pierre Duval, the patriarch of the company Julian was trying to acquire. This was the entire purpose of their charade. "Duval is old school," Julian explained as they sat in his private jet, a marvel of technology and luxury that made first class look like a public bus. "He values tradition, family, and loyalty above all else. He'll be watching our every interaction, looking for cracks." "What am I supposed to do? What do I say?" Ella asked, her stomach churning with anxiety. "You say very little," Julian instructed. "You defer to me in matters of business, but you show your intelligence in matters of culture. He's an avid collector of antique clocks." I've had my team pull every piece of available research on his collection. You need to study it. Find a way to bring it up naturally. Show him you are not just a pretty face, but a woman of substance and intellect. My equal. The phrase hung in the air, my equal. Richard had never once considered her his equal. They spent the rest of the flight role-playing with Julian playing the part of the stern Swiss patriarch, peppering her with questions about art literature and her relationship with him. He was a demanding tutor, correcting her posture, her tone the way she met his gaze. By the time they landed in Switzerland, Ella felt like an actress on opening night, her nerves stretched taut. The Duval estate was a fairy tale castle on the shores of Lake Geneva. Jean-Pierre Duval himself was a small bird-like man with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through her. Dinner that night was an ordeal. Duval spoke in a mixture of French and English, his questions polite but probing. His wife, a silent, elegant woman, watched Ella with a look of intense scrutiny. Ella followed Julian's script perfectly. She listened more than she spoke. She praised the art in their home, and at the perfect moment she brought up her admiration for a specific 18th-century Breguet clock she knew was Duval's most prized possession. Duval's eyes lit up. For the first time he seemed to relax, launching into a passionate history of the timepiece. Ella engaged him, asking intelligent questions, her genuine passion for historical objects shining through. Later in the evening, as Julian and Duval were discussing business, Duval's wife, a woman named Colette, approached Ella. "My husband is very taken with you," Colette said, her English heavily accented. "But I see things he does not." Ella's heart froze. "I'm not sure what you mean." Colette looked at the magnificent emerald on Ella's finger. "A man like Julian Croft does not love easily. He acquires. He conquers. That ring is a statement of ownership, not of affection. Tell me, my dear," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "when he looks at you, does he see a woman he loves, or does he see the final perfect piece of his collection?" The question struck Ella with the force of a physical blow, because she didn't know the answer. She looked across the room at Julian, who was deep in conversation with her husband. He was powerful, brilliant, and in that moment completely unreadable. She thought of their conversations, the books, the flashes of wit and warmth. But she also remembered his cold fury, his constant reminders that this was a transaction. Colette Duval's words had planted a seed of doubt, a terrifying question that began to bloom in the dark corners of her mind. What if this gilded cage wasn't a temporary arrangement? What if she was just another one of Julian Croft's beautiful, priceless possessions? The trip to Geneva was a resounding success for the contract, but a personal failure for Ella. While the Swiss patriarch Jean-Pierre Duval was charmed, his wife Colette had planted a seed of doubt with a single piercing question. When he looks at you, does he see a woman he loves, or the final perfect piece of his collection? The words haunted Ella, echoing in the sterile perfection of Julian's world. Life in New York became a gilded cage. While her museum flourished under her newfound influence, her relationship with Julian grew colder, more transactional. He was a brilliant director, but she was starting to feel less like a partner and more like a high-class employee. The true crack in their facade arrived in a blood-red dress. Her name was Isabella Rossi, an Italian heiress and Julian's former flame. She appeared at a ballet gala, a beautiful panther marking her territory. She openly mocked Ella with condescending praise, regaling their table with intimate stories of a wild, passionate Julian that Ella had never known. Each story was a reminder of their shared history, positioning Ella as a temporary academic curiosity. Later that night in the penthouse, the pretense shattered. "You just let her humiliate me?" Ella accused, her voice trembling with a confusing mix of anger and jealousy. "This is a business transaction, Ella," Julian stated, his voice devoid of warmth. "Your feelings of humiliation are not part of our contract." The words struck her like a slap. He was right. Her feelings, her burgeoning affection for him, none of it was in the fine print. "Colette Duval was right about you. she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You don't connect with people, you acquire them." She walked out, leaving Julian alone in his silent penthouse and creating a chasm of cold silence between them. While they communicated only through clipped, formal texts, Richard Sterling was fanning the flames of his own wounded pride. Consumed by jealousy, he hired a private investigator to dig into their fairy tale romance. It didn't take long to find the weak link, a disgruntled former employee of Julian's. For the right price, the man provided calendar entries and internal memos that told a damning story not of love but of strategy sessions, appearance preps, and contract reviews. Richard now had his weapon. He chose his battlefield, the annual Art and Finance Symposium at the Met, where Julian was scheduled to give a rare keynote interview. Leaking anonymous rumors to gossip columnists, Richard primed the city for a scandal. The night of the symposium, the air was thick with tension. Ella and Julian had reached a fragile truce moments before, with Julian offering a rare, almost apology for his coldness. "I may have been mistaken," he'd said, "about emotions not having a place in this." But the moment was cut short by a security call about the escalating rumors, and they reverted to their roles, agreeing to present a flawless united front. On stage, Julian was captivating. When the journalist inevitably asked about Ella, his eyes found hers in the front row. "Ella has a way of seeing the world that is transformative," he said, his voice laced with what sounded like genuine awe. For a heartbeat, Ella let herself believe it was real. That's when Richard Sterling stood up. "A beautiful sentiment," he called out, his voice dripping with venom. "But I have to wonder, is that sentiment part of the contract?" A shocked gasp rippled through the audience. "I think everyone here would be interested to know that this profound engagement is a 6-month business deal," Richard shouted, his face red with triumph. "That this ring on her finger isn't a symbol of love, but a line item in a budget. She is a hired actress." The silence that followed was absolute. Ella felt hundreds of eyes on her, a crushing weight of pity and scorn. This was it, the ultimate humiliation. Her instinct was to flee. But as she looked at Richard's victorious sneer, a cold, hard anger displaced the fear. He would not define her again. Slowly, Ella stood up and turned to face him. "You're right, Richard," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It started with a contract." The confession hung in the air, electric. "It started as a transaction," she continued, her voice gaining power. "I needed to save my museum a place filled with art you'd call insignificant, and Mr. Croft needed to present a certain image. But a funny thing happened when I stopped being your wife, Richard. I started to find my own voice. Julian's name opened doors, but I was the one who walked through them. His name gave me a platform, but my passion is what built the foundation." She then turned her gaze to Julian, whose face was a storm of unreadable emotion. "And in between the strategy sessions we talked. He didn't ask about his brand, he asked about my work. He read my dissertation. He listened. He saw a part of me that I had forgotten existed." Tears streamed down her face, tears of fierce, hard-won clarity. "So yes, it started as a lie, a cold arrangement. But somewhere in the middle of all the performance, something real began to grow, something that wasn't in any of the clauses. You can't put kindness in a contract. You can't legislate respect. And you certainly can't fake the feeling of being truly seen." She turned her back on Richard, dismissing him entirely. "My name is Ella Vance," she declared. "And I have more honesty and integrity in my little finger than a man who would try to destroy a woman just to soothe his own ego." A single person began to clap, then another, and then the entire auditorium was on its feet, a wave of applause washing over her. Through the roar, she saw Julian walk to the edge of the stage, his eyes locked on hers with breathtaking admiration. He took the microphone. "She's right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was my cynical plan, but the contract had a fatal flaw. It didn't account for Ella. I set out to acquire a company, and I found something infinitely more valuable." He walked down the stage steps and directly to her. As cameras flashed around them, he dropped to one knee. A collective gasp swept the room. "The original contract has been terminated," Julian said, his voice for her alone yet heard by all. So I would like to offer a new proposal, one with only a single unwritten clause. Ella Vance, would you do me the honor of making our lie the absolute truth? Will you marry me? In front of the world that had once ignored her, then tried to shame her. Ella gave her answer, tears of joy now flowing freely. Yes, she whispered as the applause erupted around them. Yes, I will. In the end, Ella Vance's story wasn't about landing a billionaire. It was about a woman who, after being reduced to a footnote in her own life, found the courage to write an entirely new book. The journey started with a lie, a desperate act of self-preservation that unexpectedly blossomed into a testament to her own worth. She learned that true visibility doesn't come from the man whose arm you're on, but from the strength you find within yourself. Julian Croft may have opened the door, but it was Ella who had the courage to step through it and build a legacy of her own. Theirs became a story not of a transaction, but of a transformation, proof that sometimes the most unexpected arrangements can lead to the most authentic truths, and that the best love stories are the ones that begin long after the contract has been voided. Thank you for listening to this story. If you were moved by Ella's journey from invisibility to empowerment, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who might need to hear it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories of incredible transformations. Don't forget to comment below what part of Ella's story resonated with you the most. We love hearing from you. Until next time.